They forced the obese girl to clean the saloon alone at midnight. The mountain man showed up. The saloon was long past closing time. The lamps flickered with dying oil, casting crooked shadows across broken bottles and muddy footprints that tracked through the main room like the remnants of a small war. Mary Ann Hutchins scrubbed the floor on her knees, her hands swollen and raw, her breath coming in shallow, shaky gasps. The wooden planks beneath her were sticky with spilled whiskey, tobacco juice, and what she suspected was blood from the fight that had broken out earlier that evening. The owner, Mr. Cornelius Webb, and his cruel friends had laughed as they ordered her to stay behind after everyone else had gone. Their voices still echoed in her mind, sharp and cutting as broken glass. "Work like this suits someone like you," Webb had sneered, his thin lips curling with contempt. "Fat girl's good for something, ain't she?" his friend Marcus had added, slapping the bar top as if he'd made the finest joke in all of Kentucky. They'd locked the doors behind them, leaving her alone in the dim saloon with nothing but the creaking of old wood and the howl of wind through the cracks in the walls for company. Or so they thought, because miles up the mountain, beyond the tree line where the wolves hunted and the snow stayed thick even in summer, a man had heard the rumors that the townsfolk of Silver Creek were using her, humiliating her, overworking her, breaking her spirit one cruel word at a time. And the mountain man did not take kindly to cruelty. His name was Ezekiel Thorne, though most folks simply called him the Ghost of Coldwater Ridge on account of how he seemed to appear and disappear like smoke in the pines. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad as an ox yoke and hands that could snap a man's neck with the ease of breaking kindling. His face was weathered from years in the wilderness, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a reminder of a grizzly bear that had made the fatal mistake of thinking him prey. Ezekiel had been living alone in his mountain cabin for the better part of 3 years, ever since he'd returned from the War of 1812 with nightmares that wouldn't let him sleep and a rage that wouldn't let him rest. He'd seen things in that war, done things that haunted him in the quiet moments. The British had taken his brother at the Battle of Queenston Heights, and Ezekiel had spent the remainder of the conflict becoming something less than human, more like the wolves he now lived among. But beneath all that violence, beneath the reputation that made grown men cross the street when they saw him coming, there remained a sliver of the man he'd once been, the man who believed in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. And when he'd come down to Silver Creek a week ago for supplies and heard how they treated Mary Ann Hutchins, that sliver had started to grow. Just as Mary Ann wiped the final stain from beneath the bar, her back aching and her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed, the saloon door creaked open. Wind rushed in, cold and sharp as a knife's edge, carrying with it the scent of pine and mountain snow. She gasped, her hand freezing mid-swipe across the bar top. She knew that silhouette framed in the doorway, backlit by the pale moonlight, broad shoulders that seemed to fill the entire frame, a stillness that reminded her of a wolf watching its territory. "It's late for you to be alone here," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within his chest. Mary Ann's voice cracked when she tried to respond. "They won't let me leave until it's spotless. If I don't obey, they'll fire me." She gestured weakly at the chaos surrounding her. "And I need this job. It's the only work I can find in this town." Ezekiel stepped fully into the saloon, letting the door swing shut behind him. His eyes, dark as coal and just as hard, swept across the filthy room. He took in the overturned chairs, some with legs broken off, the smashed glass scattered across the floor like dangerous diamonds, the crude insults carved into the wooden walls, words that made his jaw clench so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his beard. "They made this mess," he growled, his voice dropping even lower, "and made you clean it alone." Mary Ann lowered her head, shame flooding through her, though she didn't understand why. She wasn't the one who should be ashamed. She wasn't the one who had destroyed the saloon in a drunken brawl, who had treated another human being like she was worth less than the dirt beneath their boots. But shame was what she felt anyway. Shame that had been beaten into her by a lifetime of people telling her she was taking up too much space, consuming too much air, existing too loudly in a world that wanted her to disappear. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm used to it." "You shouldn't be." Ezekiel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the warmth that came from a man who spent his days chopping wood and hauling water and surviving in conditions that would kill lesser men. Close enough that she could smell pine sap and wood smoke clinging to his clothes. "Mary Ann," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth made something inside her chest tighten. No one in Silver Creek said her name like that, like she was a real person worthy of being addressed with care. "There's another way." She blinked up at him, confusion crossing her round face. In the dim lamplight, she could see the intensity in his eyes, something fierce and barely contained that both frightened and fascinated her. "Another way?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes as dark as the timberline at midnight, shadows moving in their depths like secrets waiting to be told. "I can make sure you never have to come back here again." Her breath hitched in her throat. For a moment, hope flared bright and painful in her chest. "You mean, help me find a new job? Maybe in the next town, or—" He shook his head slowly, deliberately. "I mean, I can make sure every man who hurt you never hurts anybody again." Her heart dropped like a stone down a well. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't the offer of employment or assistance she dared to hope for. This was a warning. This was vengeance incarnate standing in the doorway of the Silver Creek Saloon, offering to paint the walls with blood on her behalf. "Don't," she whispered, her voice urgent despite its softness. "Please, Ezekiel, if you fight them, the whole town will come after you. They'll hang you. They'll hunt you down like an animal." He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "Let them." For a long moment, they stared at each other in the flickering lamplight, and in that moment, Mary Ann saw something in his eyes that stole her breath away. She saw rage, yes, the kind of cold, calculated rage that came from years of watching injustice and being powerless to stop it. But she also saw something broken, something that had been shattered long before they'd met, pieces scattered across battlefields and buried in mountain snow, and had never quite been put back together. The kind of rage only a man with a past full of violence could carry, the kind of brokenness only someone who had lost everything could understand. She grabbed his sleeve without thinking, her fingers clutching at the worn fabric of his coat. Tears burned in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "I don't want anyone hurt because of me, not even them, especially not you." Ezekiel paused. His entire body, which had been coiled tight as a spring ready to release, seemed to still. He looked down at her hand on his arm, at the tears glistening on her cheeks, and something in his expression shifted. Then, to her absolute shock, he knelt down. The wild, untouchable mountain man, the ghost of Coldwater Ridge, the man who had single-handedly killed a grizzly bear and fought in one of the bloodiest battles of the war, lowered himself to the filthy saloon floor beside her. Slowly, gently, he took the rag from her trembling hand. "Then let me help you in your way," he murmured, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Not mine." And so they worked together in the deep hours of the night, cleaning the Silver Creek Saloon in silence. Ezekiel moved with surprising grace for such a large man, righting the overturned chairs and sweeping up the broken glass while Mary Ann scrubbed the tables and polished the bar top. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them in those quiet hours, something that didn't need words to be understood. Every so often, Mary Ann would glance over at him and find him already looking at her, his expression unreadable, but somehow softer than before. And when their hands accidentally brushed while reaching for the same piece of broken furniture, she felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something she'd never dared to hope for. As they worked, something shifted in the air between them. The anger that had brought Ezekiel down from his mountain began to transform into something else, something warmer, something that felt dangerously like belonging. He found himself watching the way she moved, efficient despite her exhaustion, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating on a particularly stubborn stain, the way she hummed under her breath so quietly he almost missed it a tune his mother used to sing when he was small. And Mary Ann found herself stealing glances at this strange, dangerous man who had appeared in her darkest hour, not with violence, as he'd promised, but with a kindness she hadn't known existed in the world. She noticed the care he took not to startle her with sudden movements, the way he positioned himself between her and the door, as if still standing guard even though they both knew no one was coming. The gentle way he handed her things, as if afraid his large hands might somehow hurt her by accident. By the time the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, the saloon was cleaner than it had been in months. Every surface gleamed, every chair stood straight, every shard of glass had been carefully swept up and disposed of. Mary Ann stood in the middle of the room, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Her hands ached, her back screamed in protest, and her eyes felt full of sand. But she felt something else, too, something that had been absent from her life for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope. Ezekiel walked to the door and opened it, letting in the cool morning air. Then he turned back to her and did something that made her heart stutter in her chest. He removed his heavy coat, the one made of bearskin and lined with rabbit fur, the one that had kept him alive through 3 brutal mountain winters, and crossed the room to place it gently over her shoulders. The coat was heavy and warm, and it smelled like him, like pine and smoke and mountain air. "Next time, they try to make you stay past midnight." His voice dropped to a growl that raised goosebumps along her arms, though not from fear. "I won't be so gentle." She clutched the coat around herself, unable to find words, unable to process what was happening. This man, this dangerous, fierce man, who everyone in Silver Creek whispered about with equal parts fear and fascination, had spent the entire night helping her clean a saloon, had knelt beside her on the filthy floor, had given her his coat. "Thank you," she finally managed to whisper. Ezekiel studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. Then he nodded once, turned, and disappeared into the breaking dawn. Mary Ann stood in the doorway of the Silver Creek Saloon and watched him go, his broad shoulders disappearing into the morning mist like he really was a ghost. And she realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. He had come because she mattered to him, not because she was his responsibility, not because he felt obligated, but because somewhere in his damaged heart, in that place where violence and loneliness had taken root, he had found room for her, and nothing would ever be the same. The next day, when Mr. Webb arrived at the saloon to open for business, he found it spotless. He also found Mary Ann standing behind the bar, still wearing a coat that was far too large for her, with a look in her eyes he'd never seen before. Something like steel. "I'll be finishing at sunset from now on," she said quietly. "No more midnight cleaning, and you'll pay me proper wages, same as you'd pay any man doing this work." Webb's face turned purple. "You think you can make demands? You're lucky I give you any work at all, fat as you are." The saloon door opened. Ezekiel Thorne stepped inside, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Is there a problem?" Ezekiel asked softly. Webb took one look at the mountain man's face and suddenly remembered he had urgent business elsewhere. "No problem at all. Sunset wages. Consider it done." He practically ran out the door. Mary Ann and Ezekiel looked at each other across the empty saloon, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mary Ann smiled. The mountain meadow was ablaze with wildflowers, purple columbines, and golden arnica, and delicate white bistort that swayed in the summer breeze. Mary Ann sat on a blanket spread beneath a towering pine tree, watching Ezekiel chop wood for their cabin. Their cabin. She still couldn't quite believe it. After that night in the saloon, everything had changed. Ezekiel had started coming down from the mountain more often, always finding some excuse to stop by the Silver Creek Saloon. He needed supplies. He wanted to trade furs. He'd heard there was a new brand of tobacco. But Mary Ann knew the truth. He came to see her, and slowly, carefully, like two wild animals learning to trust, they had begun to build something together. He taught her about the mountain, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find water when the streams ran dry, how to move through the forest without making a sound. She taught him how to laugh again, how to find joy in small things, how to be gentle with himself the way he was gentle with her. When he asked her to marry him, it was in his typical straightforward manner. They were sitting by the creek that ran past his cabin, and he simply turned to her and said, "I want you to stay forever. Will you marry me?" No pretty words, no grand gestures, just honesty, raw and real. She'd said yes before he'd finished the question. They'd married in a small ceremony with only the circuit preacher and Mrs. Henderson, the one woman in Silver Creek who had always treated Mary Ann with kindness. Ezekiel had worn a clean shirt and nervous expression. Mary Ann had worn a simple dress and the widest smile. And then he'd brought her home, to the mountain, to the cabin he'd built with his own hands, to a life that was harder than anything she'd known in town, but infinitely more fulfilling. Now, 6 months into their marriage, Mary Ann had never been happier. She'd learned to tend the garden Ezekiel had planted, to preserve food for the long winters, to skin the rabbits he trapped. She'd learned the mountain's rhythms when to expect the afternoon thunderstorms, when the elk would migrate through the valley, when the berries would be ripe for picking. But more than that, she'd learned what it felt like to be truly loved. Ezekiel loved her in 1,000 small ways. In the way he always saved her the best portions of meat. In the way he built her shelves for the books she treasured. In the way he held her at night, his large body curled protectively around hers, as if shielding her from all the cruelty the world had ever shown her, and she loved him just as fiercely. She loved the way he slowly opened up to her, sharing stories about his childhood, his brother, the war. She loved how he smiled, now really smiled, not just that grim expression that looked like it hurt. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was precious, like she was everything. "What are you thinking about?" Ezekiel asked, setting down his axe and walking over to the blanket. "About how lucky I am," Mary Ann answered honestly. He sat down beside her and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm the lucky one," he murmured against her hair. "You saved me, Mary Ann. That night in the saloon, I came ready to burn the whole town down, to finally become the monster everyone already thought I was." "You're not a monster," she said firmly, turning to cup his scarred face in her hands. "You never were." "Maybe not anymore," he conceded. "But I was heading there, was letting the anger consume me. And then I saw how strong you were, how you refused to let them break you, and something in me just shifted." "You saw me when no one else did," Mary Ann whispered. "You made me believe I was worth something." "You're worth everything," Ezekiel said fiercely, "and I'm going to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you know that." The first snow of winter was falling softly outside the cabin when Mary Ann felt the first pangs of labor. Ezekiel, who had faced down grizzly bears and enemy soldiers without flinching, turned absolutely pale. "I'll get Mrs. Henderson," he said, already halfway to the door. "Ezekiel, there's time," Mary Ann said, trying not to laugh despite the pain. "The baby won't come for hours yet." But he was already gone, running through the snow with single-minded determination. Mrs. Henderson arrived an hour later, shaking her head at the frantic mountain man pacing outside his own cabin. "First baby," she muttered. "They always make the fathers crazy." The labor was long and difficult. Ezekiel sat beside Mary Ann the entire time, holding her hand, murmuring encouragement, looking more terrified than she'd ever seen him. But when the baby finally arrived, a healthy, squalling boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's strong lungs, Ezekiel cried, silent tears that tracked through his beard as he held his son for the first time, this tiny life that he and Mary Ann had created together. "Hello, Jacob," Mary Ann whispered, naming him after Ezekiel's brother. "Welcome to the mountain." Ezekiel looked at his wife and son, and he felt something inside him, that last jagged piece of his broken heart, finally click into place. He had gone to war and lost his innocence. He had lost his brother and gained nightmares. He had climbed the mountain to be alone because he thought he was too damaged to be around people. But Mary Ann had found him anyway, had seen past the scars and the reputation to the man underneath, had loved him not despite his broken pieces, but because of them. And now they had this, a son, a family, a future that stretched bright and hopeful before them like the valley spread out below their mountain home. Jacob wasn't alone anymore. He had a sister now, little Sarah, who was 7 and already tough as nails. She could track a deer through the forest, identify edible plants, and out-climb boys twice her size when the occasional travelers passed through. Mary Ann stood in the doorway of their cabin, now expanded to accommodate their growing family, and watched Ezekiel teach the children how to fish in the creek. He was patient with them in a way that would have shocked the soldiers who'd served under him in the war, gentle in a way that would have amazed the people of Silver Creek who'd once feared him. She thought about that night in the saloon sometimes, that midnight when she'd been scrubbing floors and crying silent tears, certain that this was all her life would ever be. She thought about how close Ezekiel had come to choosing violence, to becoming the monster he'd feared he was. But they'd both chosen differently. He'd chosen kindness. She'd chosen courage. And together they'd built something beautiful. The Silver Creek Saloon still stood in town, but Mary Ann hadn't set foot in it since the day she'd walked out wearing Ezekiel's coat. She'd heard that Webb had sold it eventually, moved east to St. Louis. She didn't care. That life felt like it belonged to someone else. This life, this mountain, this man, these children, this was real. "Mama!" Sarah called, running up from the creek with a fish almost as big as she was. "I caught it myself. Didn't need any help." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mary Ann said, crouching down to properly admire the catch. Ezekiel approached more slowly, Jacob walking beside him. At 10 years old, Jacob was already showing signs of having his father's height and build, but he had Mary Ann's kind eyes, her gentle spirit. "That's my girl," Ezekiel said proudly, ruffling Sarah's hair. "We'll cook that for dinner. You can help clean it." "Can I really?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "Really, Jacob will show you." The children ran off together, arguing good-naturedly about the proper technique for cleaning fish. Ezekiel wrapped his arms around Mary Ann from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. They stood there together in the late afternoon sun, watching their children play, listening to the mountain winds sing through the pines. The world beyond their valley continued to turn, towns grew, borders shifted, the nation expanded westward. But here, in their corner of the wilderness, time moved differently. Here, two broken people had found each other in the darkness and built a life together in the light. "I love you," Ezekiel murmured into her hair. "I love you, too," Mary Ann replied. "My mountain man." He laughed that real, genuine laugh that she'd coaxed out of him year by patient year. "Your mountain man," he agreed. "Always?" As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the family gathered together to cook Sarah's fish. They ate dinner on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. Jacob told stories that made Sarah giggle. Sarah showed off the new tracking skills she'd learned. Ezekiel and Mary Ann exchanged glances full of contentment and love. Later, after the children were tucked into bed, Mary Ann and Ezekiel sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. The mountain was dark around them, but they weren't afraid. This was home. "Do you ever regret it?" Mary Ann asked softly. "Giving up your solitude, taking on a family?" Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he pulled her closer and kissed her forehead. "I regret every day I spent alone on this mountain before you came. Every day I wasted thinking I was too broken to deserve happiness. You and our children, you're the best thing that ever happened to me, Mary Ann. You saved my life that night in the saloon, even though you'll never believe it. We saved each other, she corrected gently. Yes, he agreed. We did. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the moon rise over the distant peaks. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, not threatening, just singing its lonely song to the night. But Ezekiel and Mary Ann weren't lonely. They had each other, and that made all the difference. The mountain had once been Ezekiel's prison, the place he'd fled to escape his demons. Now it was his sanctuary, the foundation on which he'd built the life he'd never dared to dream of. And Mary Ann, who had once believed herself unworthy of love, had learned that she was not only worthy, but treasured. In Ezekiel's eyes, she was beautiful. In her children's hearts, she was everything. And in her own mirror each morning, she finally saw what they saw, not the broken girl scrubbing saloon floors, but a strong woman who had survived, endured, and ultimately thrived. That midnight encounter at the Silver Creek Saloon had changed both their lives forever. It had been the moment when two lonely souls had recognized each other across the darkness and chosen connection over isolation, healing over vengeance, love over fear. And in the years that followed, they built something that couldn't be broken by cruelty or diminished by hardship. They built a family. They built a home. They built a love that would endure long after the old saloon had crumbled to dust and the town of Silver Creek had faded into history. Because some loves are like the mountains, ancient, enduring, and absolutely unshakable. And theirs was one of them.